Hello and welcome to another episode of PDN Live. I'm Shannon, your moderator, and with me tonight we have Rob Pincus from the Personal Defense Network, and we have our guest William Aprill, a licensed mental health professional specializing in post-traumatic interventions. And tonight's topic is dealing with violent behavior. And if you're listening to us live and you have a question you want answered or a topic that you want with more details on, just type in the comments below and we'll try our best to answer it. And if you like what you're hearing and seeing, sign up for the Personal Defense Network newsletter for free and check it out in the link below. You can catch us on Facebook, Personal Defense Network, Twitter, P_D_N, and on Instagram at PD Network. And you can send us any comments at social@personaldefensenetwork.com. So Rob, how have you been and what have you been up to since we last saw you?
Wow, let's see, we did the last one, I think just before my daughter's wedding. This tour is punctuated by all kinds of big social events, family events for me. So we did the last one with Caleb, and then I went off to my daughter's wedding, and then I have had the busiest month, I think, potentially in history. There's like this 6-week stretch from right after the wedding, the first week in May, until the middle of June. That honestly is the longest stretch of back-to-back-to-back-to-back classes because of the family interruptions this spring and summer. I'm really consolidating a bunch of training in. So the PDN training tour has had its busiest May on record. I've got another overfull class this week. I'm in La Crosse, just north of La Crosse, Wisconsin, in Onalaska at the Gander Mountain Academy, and doing some great work there with some of the local CFS instructors that are certified to work as the Gander Mountain Academy staff. And then I'm off to Minnesota, back at PDN headquarters at the end of the week and over the weekend, and then to Iowa for a series of back-to-back-to-back-to-back. I think there's 5 classes in a row that are all full or over full, and then off to Colorado. And then, of course, big family event, having my daughter that got married in May makes me an empty nester right now, and I have another daughter being born at the end of June. So everyone who's signed up for classes in Colorado, there's a chance that it will be interrupted. My presence, I'll jump out, and we have some great standby instructors, actually guys that are going to be helping out with the class anyway, to take over in case my wife in Denver goes into labor. And I said we'll give everybody 10 free PDN training DVDs if I have to duck out for a few hours for the birth or miss the rest of the class.
And where can we find you to see all these events unfold?
Facebooks, Instagrams, / Rob Pincus or / Rob Pincus Pro, at Pincus Rob, Twitter, Instagram, and of course PersonalDefenseNetwork.com and all the Personal Defense Network stuff for the training. ICEtraining.us is the place to go to sign up for courses. But of course the PDN tour is bigger than me. We've got 10 other instructors out teaching as part of the Personal Defense Network training tour, and people can learn more about that at PersonalDefenseNetwork.com and follow the training tab to see the list of courses and get links to sign up for any of the great opportunities to hang out with your personal defense contributors in person, not just live on the interwebs.
Awesome. And William, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background revolving around our topic tonight, dealing with violent behavior?
Well, sure. I started out working at the sheriff's office here in my hometown of New Orleans. Then I worked for the United States Marshal Service in the Eastern District of New Orleans. After that, I went back to college and finished up college, then to graduate school, and I've been working in mental health for almost 20 years now. And just because of that combination of things, I've tended to work a lot in the area where mental health and the courts overlap, which puts you, of course, in the realm of the violent criminal offender pretty often. I spend about half my time teaching on the road and about half my time with a private practice in mental health here in New Orleans.
And where can people find you if they want to get in contact with you or follow you on any of the social media? Where can they find you?
Well, you'd have to bounce the signal off of Rob because the sun never sets on Rob. No, actually, I'm a social media Luddite. I keep threatening to make a website, but I haven't yet. The closest thing to it is you can find me on Facebook. Just last name is Aprill, Aprill.
Awesome. Well, we'll jump right in, and like I mentioned before, if you're just joining us, if you have any questions or if a topic sparks your interest, just write it in the comments below. We'll do our best to get around to it, and I know that at the end, Rob and William will hang out for a little bit and answer your questions after the PDN Live. So we'll just jump right in. And these questions we got via email, Facebook, Twitter, so thank you so much for those of you that submitted questions. So William, the first one is for you, and Dobson says, please speak to the efforts to de-escalate situations before they turn critical.
I would argue that the moment of the incident, I mean, you're at a kind of criticality already. Our power to dispose of how an event's going to go decreases as we get closer and closer to the event. The time to really manage an event is well before it happens. Once an event has started, you're really only left with the kind of most primal skills, your most physical skills. The majority of the work should be done beforehand. It's a little bit like fighting fire. There's no good way to fight a fire. It's prevention where the value is. I like to think about for the average person in a sort of risk encounter, the number one skill should be limit setting, which is how to set a boundary between yourself and someone who seeks to encroach on it, either verbally or physically. But that's the last of the limits before things go live, as I put it, which means you're actually intervening on the other person, either verbally or physically. So I would say that at the moment, it's well past time.
Gotcha. And Rob, Billy Mike asks, I'm originally from Philadelphia, and a few years ago, a coworker was beaten by a flash mob of teens. He was thrown from his bicycle and stomped until he was barely breathing. He was left with brain damage. My question is, as an armed citizen, at what point should you draw your weapon during such an incident? In this case, would it be advisable to draw without firing back to the mob, or to back the mob off if you cannot get them off their mark? He and his wife are both trained and armed. What is the best method to peel out of such an ambush?
Let me take a piece of that. I think I'm not a fan of brandishing a firearm in a personal defense moment as a warning, particularly in any kind of a mob crowd situation, because now you can't watch 360 degrees. So while you're gesturing towards this person in front of you, who knows what's coming up behind you or coming to grab the gun. I'd much rather see somebody not pull the gun out until they're determined that they need to use it. When they need to use it, then of course it changes things. Now you've brought a gun into the fight, and that can escalate or de-escalate, and you never know. And maybe that's a good time to sort of toss it to William, because I think there are a lot of cliches about behavior you can take to de-escalate, to make yourself look tough and hard and not like a victim, and eye contact and walk confidently, that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of cliches, and again, I was kind of throw that to you, William. What are some of the things that you hear in the community about do this so you won't be a victim that might also backfire on us?
Well, you'll hear that notion all the time that even the cliche of racking the action of a shotgun is certainly going to have some massive effect on a crowd. The notion that a crowd or even an individual criminal, someone who participates in a criminal lifestyle, is going to be frightened by the presence of a pistol is just a little bit silly, and I think that we run the risk of really playing out the old cliche of drawing a pistol, not intending to use it, and having it taken away. That's the worst nightmare. You haven't improved the situation at all, by introducing a firearm uncontrolled into that kind of environment. So I think I think a mob attack is certainly lethal force. I mean, even a small group of people, 2 or 3 people, can kick and stomp someone to death very easily. So I mean, I think it's a matter of being able to articulate that you were faced with lethal force, and be prepared to use a firearm to countermand it. But the worst case is to take it out as a message. I just think that's a recipe for disaster.
So the second part of that question, with Philly Mike, he and his wife are both trained and armed. So what's the best method to peel out of that, or to get out of that situation?
When we talk about crowds, if you're being targeted as the crowd, well, if you're being targeted, by the crowd, then you're fighting. Now you're in a moment, kind of like William said, you're beyond de-escalation or avoidance, and now you're fighting, and that's implementing all the techniques and tactics and defensive tools that you think are appropriate in the moment. I think beforehand, when that crowd starts to form, one of the things we talk about is getting to the edge of a crowd, right? You don't want to be kind of trampled and pushed from all directions and moving with the crowd or kind of sucked along, fighting to the edge of the crowd, not trying to move against it, not necessarily trying to outpace it and move with it, but trying to fight your way to the edge of the crowd, maybe moving with the current a little bit, get up against the edge, get to the building, get to the walkway, get to the stairway, get to the aisle, get out of that crowd. So now you're not potentially fighting in 360 degrees, and you at least have potential stability against anyone who comes right up against you, using that wall or that tree or that fence line or whatever it is as a barricade. I think a lot of people worry about getting trapped. You're already trapped if you're stuck in the middle of that crowd. I think fighting to the edge and then being able to control at least some of the directions you have to worry about is one way to avoid being in a worse situation you need to be in when that crowd starts growing or when you're in that mob. And that can go for a natural disaster. Just people trying to get out of a movie theater would be the typical example, or a concert or any kind of sporting event. Don't get stuck in the middle of that crowd and get trampled. Fight your way to the edge and control some space.
No, I would agree. If you can get to the edge of a space up against any enclosure, you can automatically lower the scope of your problem. If you're in the middle of a crowd, you're fighting in 360 degrees. If you can get to a wall, you're fighting in 180 degrees. If you can get into a corner, you're fighting in 90 degrees. There's just less area to cover. I mean, congratulations to the caller and his spouse for making the decision to be armed in the first place. But now they've got to do the next steps.
Gotcha. So, William, Frank writes, my job Sunday morning is to watch the hundreds of people entering church. We have 50+ new people each week. What should I watch for to ID a potentially violent person, a stalker or someone wanting to get to a specific person? So how could they watch out for a potentially violent person?
Yeah, the NYPD put out an excellent infographic about visual cues of people carrying weapons, and it was a very clever and very succinct infographic. Things like an asymmetrical walk, things about holding up a belt line under the weight of a weapon, and if someone picks a poor set of carry gear, it's actually work to carry a pistol. Seasonally inappropriate clothing, long coats, things like that. These are kind of behavioral cues that I think are a telling sign. But most importantly, people that look abnormal, people that look out of the flow. Folks walking into church have a certain behavior set. Anyone taking part in the crowd movement but not taking part in the normal ebb and flow of that movement. People that are in the crowd but who just don't look like they're there for the same reason as everyone else. A stalker is going to be looking for the object of the stalking, obviously. So someone who's not participating in the sort of normal ebb and flow of a worship service is somebody that should catch their eye. There's no cost to being suspicious of someone. And the more you watch, the more cues you'll either see and rule the person in or not see and rule the person out. So I would ask them to keep their eyes peeled for just the difference from the mass. The mass of people are by and large normal. And so when you're looking for something other than that, the bar should be set very, very low. Not for specific threats. I mean, someone walking in carrying a machine gun with a bandolier over their chest is probably a little more specific of a sign than we'd look for. But people that don't fit the normal pattern of movements and demeanor, that's the first thing to look for.
So let's take this to the next step, I guess. So you have ID'd someone outside of the norm of what you're looking for, or a churchgoer. What next?
I think then you start looking for specific behavioral cues. The Israeli airport security is really made an art of describing the look of people who are there for the purpose of violence. Asymmetrical gait, large, bulky clothing, perspiring when that's out of season, people who just are constantly scanning the environment in a way that makes it clear that they're not there for the function that everyone else is there for.
Okay.
A lot of the criminal behavior would look a lot like the kind of thing that somebody who just came out of a, color code, old-fashioned 360-degree, head on a swivel kind of behavior looking for threats, right? Well, nobody really behaves that way in regular life, right? You look at the people you're hanging out with, you talk to people, you might glance over at the door every once in a while, but you aren't constantly scanning, constantly nervous. You aren't fixating on people that aren't part of your group and watching them as you maneuver and move. In the executive protection world, there's a lot of examples. That the Ronald Reagan attack is one that stands out. There's several. episodes of finding photos that were taken 30 seconds before, a minute or 2 minutes before, and you can see that the behavior of the crowd versus the behavior of the would-be assassin or the attacker is so out of sync. You know, when everyone's clapping and everyone's looking to the left, but the one guy is looking over here at his target and has his hands in his pocket, that's a clue. Is it easy in retrospect to Monday morning quarterback that? Absolutely. But now if you're the church security guy watching a crowd, that's why we Monday morning quarterback, is so you start to figure out what to look for.
Sure, I think the purpose of Monday morning quarterbacking is so that the next time you can Sunday morning quarterback.
Right.
You know, you can see these, you know, these oddities, just the behavioral oddities. People moving when everyone else is still. People still when everyone else is moving. These are the kinds of things that should catch our attention at the moment.
So let's get psychological here. Is there a disconnect in the way criminals approach the world versus normal people approach the world?
Yes and no. You know, this comes up all the time. I'll run into someone in a training class who really resists the notion that they share the same species with a violent criminal actor. You know, with a criminal whose repertoire includes interpersonal violence as a part of their daily routine. And they'll use words like trolls and goblins and monsters and creatures from the deep, and it's just a dangerous kind of thinking, because we know a lot about people and how they think and how they act and how they make decisions, but we don't know anything about goblins and trolls. So spending our time chasing non-existent creatures instead of using what we know, just in my mind, is counterproductive. Offenders have morals, values, ethics. They have these things. They just don't share them with the general public. But there is a moral sense. If you want to see truly aggrieved person, steal from a thief. There's a true sense of moral offense. They're incredibly shocked and upset that this has happened. It is wrong in their eyes. And that, I think, is the fundamental difference. In their world, exploiting others is perfectly okay. Being exploited is never okay. The notion that someone could exploit them is almost unthinkable and truly morally offensive. So yeah, it's almost an inversion or sort of a photographic negative. There are values, there are governing beliefs, but they're just in relief to ours. They're sort of dark where we're light and light where we're dark.
Interesting.
William, I think another thing you've talked about in the past in some of your seminars that I really found important to understand from a normal perspective is how normal the reactions are, but how misplaced the emotions might be. So, for example, if someone values their vehicle inordinately, you scratching their vehicle with a shopping cart might be the greatest offense to them in the world, and how that perspective shift needs to be understood to be able to understand why someone is behaving completely rationally from their perspective but not ours.
No, you're absolutely right. You know, when two quote-unquote normal folks bump fenders in the parking lot, their concerns are, goodness, I hope my car isn't damaged. I hope this person's not a jerk. I hope my car insurance doesn't go up. But if that vehicle is viewed by, let's say, a violent criminal actor as an extension of their self, as an extension of their own self-worth, it's not that you bumped a shopping cart into my car. It's that you attacked the essence of who I am. And if I don't have much in life, let's say that car is the only thing that I've realized from my criminal history, let's say selling drugs, participating in a gang, committing crime, and that's what I've got to show for it. And when you disrespect it, that's a binary state. You've either disrespected it or not. Degree doesn't enter into it. And so the response is disproportionate too. So that I think that's a very important point, is that our sense of perspective is generally lacking. We tend to view the world through our own filter and not to take things as seriously as they can be taken. But you can't really opt out of someone else's value system.
So Todd writes, and Rob, this is probably a question for you. He's read several books and listened to interviews and podcasts with experts and instructors regarding violent behavior, and particularly being aware of the cues to violent behavior. Can you recommend any books or training courses that cover the specific cues and the what to look fors that are open to non-law enforcement officers?
Wow. Honestly, William, do you have anything off the top of your head? Because as far as just like going to Amazon and typing in a book title, go.
Sure. I think there's a relatively recent book called Left of Bang, is really quite a good book about overall awareness, environmental awareness, and I think it's quite good. In terms of classes that are open to the public, Craig Douglas's classwork on managing unknown contacts, I think, is fantastic. There's a very intensive and applied block for understanding the pre-assault cues, and he goes into very great detail about pre-assault cues, and that's an excellent course.
Yeah, I agree. And as far as live coursework, one of the other things you can do is get the opportunity to go through a course designed to help you be a role player in simulation scenario training, because if you understand the perspective of how to send those cues, of course, that helps you learn in how to look for those cues. So if you understand, as being a good role player, being a good bad guy, how to let somebody get the opportunity to see how you might be preparing for an attack, well, of course, helps you understand those attacks. Now, there's no doubt that in the executive protection, private security world, there's plenty of books and manuals out there. You know, whether it's going through a school like ESI or EPI and getting your hands on some of their distance education materials, which is relatively easy to do. You don't need to be a police officer. You don't need to be anything else. You can get your hands on those course materials. Craig Douglas is a great class, the Managing Unknown Contacts, and he often runs it in conjunction with his Extreme Close Quarters Concepts class, which is kind of like then the worst case scenario of you see the pre-contact cue, but as William said right off the bat, it's a little late, and now the attack is there, or you missed the pre-contact cue, and now you're physically engaged and entangled. And the other thing he does is he'll offer that Managing Unknown Contacts course at a lot of training conferences that Craig teaches at, so that's a great one. And then you can look for a lot of the other material from the executive protection world, or distance education, and the security world, distance education especially. Bouncers, just a book on bouncing is going to be helpful.
Sure. And here's aside from specific behavioral cues, let's say facial grooming cues, touching anywhere about the face and head tends to be a pre-assault cue. But training yourself to be resilient, meaning that training to take on a surprising stimulus and responding quickly, is something you can do at almost no cost. And I like to think of the cheapest way to do things. And one of the best is if you take part in gun sports, IDP or USPSA, skip the walkthrough. If you don't know what's coming in a stage, if you on purpose skip the walkthrough, you have no choice but to respond to what you see once the buzzer sounds. And training yourself to be surprised, but gather yourself and get back above that shock threshold, that's a very valuable kind of training, and it's very, very low cost. It's just, the only thing it costs you is your scores. So a little ego blow.
And that goes for the same. I mean, physically, we integrate that into a lot of our counter-ambush firearms training. So you not only have a mental, not quite sure what's coming on, but then you integrate the natural physical reactions and then respond and convert them into your draw stroke or your unarmed defense. You know, that stuff that in the unarmed world, personal defense readiness has been doing for a couple decades, and then obviously inside of the CFS program and other programs, finding ways to physically allow yourself to convert that surprise and mentally to process the information and then execute your learned responses. That's the heart of counter-ambush training. And unfortunately, while we may watch the doors and look for our exits and try to be aware of who's around us, ambushes are the worst-case scenario, and that's really what I think we should be training for.
Yeah, and I think if you can become habituated to a kind of resiliency pattern where you're sort of startled above a shock threshold, but then recover beneath it to where you can take action, that's something that you can get inoculated to over time. It just takes some effort.
So if anyone's just tuning in, this is PDN Live, Dealing with Violent Behavior. Our special guest tonight is William Aprill, a licensed mental health professional specializing in post-traumatic interventions. And we also have Rob Pincus, PDN and ICE training. If you have any questions that you want to get answered during the live chat here, just go ahead and type in the comments below. We'll do our best to get around to your questions. And if we don't, just hang out for a little bit afterwards, because Rob and William will be on to answer questions probably for about half an hour after the chat. And if you like what you're hearing or seeing, sign up for the Personal Defense newsletter for free and check it out in the link below. Okay, lots of great questions and a lot of great discussion here. William, Grant writes, please address group dynamics as an influence into behavior. I assume if there are two or more potential threats, 1, the danger level is multiplied, 2, the leader will be bolder and more intent on demonstrating power and dominance, and 3, the opportunity to de-escalate is reduced considerably. Similarly, if you must respond forcefully to a more than one threat scenario, what tactics are effective?
I guess to take the last part first, you know, the same principle applies in both sort of good guy inaction, if we could call it that, and bad guy inaction. For good guy inaction, there'll be an event going on, and a group of people will not respond. Typically, we call that diffusion of responsibility. Everyone thinks that in a large crowd, well, someone will do something, so I don't have to. Now, what you'll see in a large crowd of bad guys, so to speak, is a diffusion of initiative. Once someone has stepped forward and taken an aggressive act, let's say, then the others are emboldened to follow suit. It's that first breaking of the ice that starts the rat packing that you'll hear about. You know, I would argue that you know, that initial ice breaking has got to be managed forcefully. The crowd has to see that the first person to step forward and take an aggressive action has paid a price. But again, you know, thinking that you can dissuade a crowd is a little silly. I mean, you know, the crowd is the power of a crowd is so big that you've got to, I think, execute whatever you've got as forcefully as you've got it almost right away. But especially if it's triggered by the first person to take that aggressive action, it's got to be met with maximally aggressive defensive action.
So we got a live question in, and it actually relates to another question that was emailed in, so I'm going to kind of merge the two together. And Rob, with the constant discussion about Islamic jihadists in our country today and how we might come to face with it, do you have any DVDs that would address hand-to-hand defense against a supposed trained killer? You know, we're not talking about the street thug or mugger, but training to deal with a terrorist whose intention is trained.
I honestly, I mean, it's not like you're going to get challenged to a duel by the professional killer. You know, I don't think there's a huge difference in fundamental response concepts. So not to dismiss the question, I think the reality is that if it's the trained killer who's got a 300 Win Mag and a scope sitting on a hill and shoots you in the back of the head, I got nothing for you. If it's a spree killer that shows up at the mall, at first glance, the guy with the shotgun or the AK-47 or the pistol in the mall that's shooting people in the food court, I don't care if he's got 29 friends or he's a lone gunman. At that moment, I'm dealing with that guy. Now, in the aftermath of dealing with that initiative that got my attention at first and that I had to respond to, now in the aftermath, I'm looking around and I'm assessing, and at some point, if I notice 7 other people dressed like him shooting up the mall, now maybe I'm going to stop the bad guy and protect the people of the mall mindset might change significantly, right? There's a difference between this guy might turn the gun on me, let me take action here because I'm in a clear space, I can take the shot, I don't have to worry about bystanders or background, and it's a whole other thing when, you know, you're John McClane without a script, right? Because that's the advantage he had. It was a movie. Right now we've got real terrorists running around, trained, untrained, I don't know, I'm not interviewing them. I've got a whole group of people purposefully trying to kill people in my environment. The idea of I'm going to defend myself and sort of stand my ground goes away real fast. I think that may be the one difference I would say in technique is, yeah, 2 guys robbing a store and I think they're about to start killing people, maybe I would take action. 12 guys open up with AK-47s, you know, I'm with my XDS with 2 magazines, I'm not saving the day here. So at some point you have to realize that evasion may be your only real option when you're in this kind of an organized spree event. Other than that, and so we've got our active shooter response. You know, back before we really started using the term spree killer, we used the leftover law enforcement terminology of active shooter. We've got that DVD in the PDN collection, and then all of the other things, you know, defending others, you know, shooting in defense of others, as well as all the fundamental concepts from CFS or CFC all still apply. It's just you've got this group dynamic of potentially overwhelming force that you now have to factor into pushing you towards evasion much faster than a single person might push you to evasion. William?
And I think most importantly is you've got to think about, you know, what are you disposed to do? You know, I ask students all the time, how are you wired? Because you will often find your feet moving toward a problem that your mind is telling you is not a good idea. So we've got to keep an open enough mind to realize that, you know, slim odds, poor odds are one thing. You know, charging into the mass of terrorists taking them all, there's no odds there at all. That's just suicide. So we've got to remain, we've got to have our thought process be permeable enough that the situation can sink in and let the situation determine how we're going to respond.
So just to add another element to this discussion, this came across on the live feed below. So is the threat from terrorists on military families valid, and what do you recommend to thwart that threat?
Well, I think it's, to quote the trainer John Hearn, who said, for some matters, it's not the odds, it's the stakes. If the odds are very low, but the stakes are very high, that should flavor our thinking. I think it's a kind of a spectacular event. I think it would get an incredible amount of attention if, say, the family of a deployed service member were to be attacked by an Islamist, terror element. So that, I think, makes it a very compelling target for them because it would be covered in every press outlet in the world. So I think, I think that does make it a legitimate risk with very, very high stakes, even if the odds are low. How that should be addressed in terms of information outlay, social media presence, things like that. Perhaps Rob want to talk about that.
Yeah, there's part of personal security is not making yourself look like an attractive target, right? So I can't imagine in today, in 2015, I can't imagine the military spouse that male or female, that isn't proud of the fact that their spouse is serving, that isn't proud of America and the military and doesn't want to show support for that. There is certainly a security issue, as William just said. You are saying, hey, I'm a potential target. You can come attack me and get a lot of press because I'm the husband that stays at home while my wife is deployed, or I'm the wife that's at home raising 2 kids while my husband's deployed. But when we start changing our behavior, so now this is, I don't have a spouse that's deployed, easy for Rob to say, but when we start changing our behavior because of the fear of terrorism, when the terrorism, which is that creation of fear in the public environment for political motive, starts winning, is when we don't fly the American flag, we don't say we're proud of our troops, we don't say, I'm the husband or wife of a deployed soldier, and we don't talk about it, we don't have those logos on our cars. At some level, the terrorists are winning. So what I think it becomes is really understanding, where are you going to be targeted? Is it coming and going from the PX? Is it coming and going from the VA? Is it coming and going from areas where maybe you do want to be a little bit more low profile in certain situations? If there's a certain population that we're at war with and there's a bunch of immigrants from that culture in an environment that might have angst about what's happening overseas, do you want to drive through their neighborhood with American flags out your window saying, yeah, I'm so proud my husband might be invading your home country right now? Maybe you want to have a little discretion, maybe you want to use a little caution. So, and those same things would go in other situations. If you knew a certain group was being targeted, you have to balance your pride, your patriotism, your ego, your wanting to not be scared against common sense precautions. And that's really what that disclosure and that discretion consideration, I think, is all about.
So let's back up a little bit. We got a couple of questions in the live feed, mostly about talking about other hints of violence indicators. We talked about touching your face. What other common cues indicate aggressive action that might be forthcoming, while someone's walking down the street, in a parking lot, in the neighborhood? Are there any other additional cues that people could be looking for?
Sure. I think when you're talking about the first kind you mentioned, that's very close. Someone within sort of a social space, let's say 4 feet and a little bit out from that. Well, that's very, very close. The kind of gestures that you'll see, like grooming gestures, or what we call a target glance. You can see some often looking over your shoulders is a sign that an attack's about to be initiated. But a layer out from that in social space, let's say someone more than 2 car lengths away, I think people should pay a great deal of attention to anyone who changes direction relative to any change in your direction. Someone who starts paralleling you, someone who changes their path to intersect yours. These are things that can be seen at a little bit of a distance, that can be responded to at a little bit of a distance. Arm's length is awfully late to be trying to pick up on pre-assault cues, because you're so close that the attack has a higher likelihood of succeeding. So I always press people to push that bubble of awareness outward so that you can see people and judge their actions 2 car lengths or more away, I think is a favorable bit of reactionary distance.
Rob, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think that's the hopefulness, right? The textbook says maintain the quote-unquote reactionary gap, right, and keep that bubble. But I don't know how realistic that is, and that gets us back to the point that William made earlier, and I wholeheartedly agree that we have to be training to be caught off guard. We have to be training for when we aren't in some head-on-a-swivel condition and we see it coming. Now, if we do, great. What do we look for? We look for those, somebody who's fixating on us, somebody who changes direction, somebody who initiates movement, right? So we're walking down the street, we see somebody 2.5 blocks away leaning against the telephone pole, we get half a block away and they start coming towards us. Well, maybe they're going to ask us for what time it is, maybe they're going to ask us if we have a bus schedule, maybe they're going to pull out a knife. I don't know. But I know that their initiation of movement relative to our presence or our path is a cue that we can pick up on, as William said, further away. Now, I can decide 2.5 blocks away to cross the street. If I see a group of gnarly youths at the corner ahead of me, why go through? Why have them make a comment? Why have them say something? Why have me risk looking at them wrong or not looking at them right, or who knows what they're looking for as a cue to that I'm a victim or that I'm invading their space? Why don't I just cross the street and go across the street? If they move with me, that's an issue. Now I have to really decide what to do. And maybe just stopping and doing some window shopping, stopping and making a phone call, and let's see if they come towards me. Now I'm controlling my space as opposed to walking into what becomes an ambush. So, but again, we're getting very myopic in that that's a thing. The bigger picture is people's behavior that seems cued to yours. Can you see that coming? Yes. If you're always looking for it. But if you're reading a map, or if you're on the phone, or if you're talking to somebody next to you, or if you're looking for an address, that's when you can miss it. Now you're inside of that traditional cliched reactionary gap, and that's where counter-ambush training becomes so important.
Sure, and I certainly didn't mean to imply that you can maintain a reactionary gap. I mean, the world is not built in 21-foot increments. I mean, the notion that you can keep anyone 21 feet away from you, the traditional tool of 21 feet, is a little bit silly. I mean, you're not, you'll never get on an elevator, you'll never go in a building, I frequently say you can't order a latte in Seoul. You just can't. And so we're in all kinds of circumstances where we don't have a reactionary gap in terms of distance, which makes us think, distance equals time. But there are plenty of other ways to maintain a reactionary advantage, one of posture, one of demeanor, and especially expanding the bubble out so that, let's say, someone at the 2 car lengths doesn't necessarily it's that I would notice someone entering that space, not any notion that I can keep people out of that space. It's just that as they get closer and closer through the layers of the bubble, so to speak, they get more and more of my direct attention. But someone at 2 arms length or single arms length, that's assault range. That's primary assault range, not a range that should draw my attention. I mean, that's a range that would indicate that an assault's already underway.
So on that, what if it's about a woman or anyone walking to her car at night? How can you be perceived as aware so you avoid a dangerous situation?
Well, there's nothing wrong with being seen to be aware. I find it interesting that people ask me all the time, is if there's some covert way of maintaining awareness. Well, no, and moreover, why would you want one? If I can be seen as being aware of my environment, that in itself is a no-go cue for some violent criminal actors. If they're looking for someone easy to assault, the more aware the person is, the less easy they are to assault. It's more advantageous for them to just wait for the next person who isn't at all aware of their environment. So I like to make a big show of looking around, a big show of seeing what's in my environment. A, because I might actually see something that concerns me, and B, if I don't see the thing that concerns me, perhaps they'll see me and they can't run the risk of having been seen. So, being seen as being actively aware of your environment is not a bad thing. It's nothing to hide. In fact, just the opposite.
And I'll go a step further. There are certainly times in some environments where I will give a little nod, or if I have to cross within somebody's path who, if they're panhandling or if it clearly looks like they're about to come up to me anyway, I'll engage them in conversation. As they're about to come up and ask me if I know where the bus station is, or if I have an extra couple dollars, or what time it is, or whatever might be about to happen, it's not hard for me to say, hey, do you know if this store stays open till midnight? Hey, do you know where this is or what that is? Totally throw them off their game. right? Their game was they were going to encroach me, and I was going to be apologetic and kind of back down and try to help them or get them away in any way I could, give them the money, whatever. But the reality is now I've just made them my best friend. Hey, let me ask you a question. Hey, come over here. And they don't want to engage you in conversation if they're there to get $1. They certainly don't want to engage you in conversation if they're there to attack you in some way or get close to you or get you to move with them. So being a little more assertive. Now, I don't recommend that for a 22-year-old girl walking down the streets of Manhattan, walking up to somebody that's approaching them and engaging them in conversation and trying to become their best friend. But there are certainly the kind of people that are probably big, members of PDN and most of our audience who could get away with being a little more assertive and a little bit more obvious about the fact that they are paying attention and that they're not afraid of a confrontation, not looking for a confrontation, but there's a confidence medium ground there where you can certainly, I think, take the panhandler or the potential low-level threat off their game. And that's what we deal with most of the time in the urban environment.
Absolutely, sure. If you think about it, when you're projecting presence forward into the encounter like that, you're disrupting a behavioral loop that may have started. If the behavioral loop starts with just someone sort of engaging you, almost non sequitur, hey man, you got a cigarette, hey, do you know what time it is? But that's the thin end of the wedge. They're trying to make an encounter grow longer and longer. Say, can I borrow $1? And then if that doesn't go well, then there's the implication of force and then maybe the use of force. But if you can project presence into the encounter, you can often upset that kind of behavioral loop and get, a WTF moment where there's just sort of a behavioral reset. I have a friend who frequently, when he's engaged with a panhandler and not able to dissuade them behaviorally, he preemptively asks them for $1. Hey man, you got $1? And he said they'll sometimes just freeze in place because it's so startling to them, so counter to what they think the process is going to be like, that they just can't recover before he's already gone.
For those of you that are just joining us, welcome. We're talking about dealing with violent behavior. Great discussion so far. Our guest tonight is William Aprill, a licensed mental health professional specializing in post-traumatic interventions. And as always, we have Mr. Rob Pincus of PDN and ICE training. If you have a question and you're listening to us live, type it in the comments below and we'll do our best to get around to it. As well as Rob and William will be hanging out for a little bit afterwards to answer questions in the comment section just right below. And then if you like what you're hearing and you're seeing, you can sign up for the Personal Defense Network newsletter for free. Who doesn't like free? So check it out in the link below. Okay, so we've got a question about, let's see here, let me find it. I just had it. Here it is. What specific actions or training would you recommend to prepare for the case where you are faced with a light, threatening, violent attack and are unable to use a firearm to defend themselves? So that first part of the question, Rob, just how do you prepare yourself for an attack when you are unarmed? And then the second part of that question, William, how do you prepare mentally for that event, unarmed?
You want to go first, Rob?
Fitness. Easy answer. Like if you're a lot of people rely on that gun as the magic talisman where they don't have to do sit-ups, they don't have to do push-ups, they don't have to have any cardio, they don't have to have unarmed skills, they don't have to have verbal skills, they don't have to have awareness skills. I've got a gun, I'll be fine, right? And that's one of those cliches that unfortunately is really true. There are a lot of people like that the gun is a magic talisman to them. They'll be fine because they can shoot a tight group in a bullseye target or even just simply because they have the gun. If you're really serious about personal defense, you have to take your fitness seriously. I don't care how good your one knockout punch is or your elbow or your joint locks or whatever it is, if you don't have the physical fitness to not only weather whatever that first physical attack is that gets inside of the range where you might be able to use your gun, or to weather an extended duration, not only physical use of violence against somebody, but the defense of violence against you, keeping yourself from getting knocked out, keeping yourself from getting disabled. If you don't have the fitness to stand up with that, it really doesn't matter what skills you have. Now, sort of inevitably, if you're training in unarmed defense, you're going to get more fit. There's going to be a amount of physical activity there. One of the dangers, and I see this all the time in the martial arts world, is people who 20 years ago may have been really, badass martial artists, whatever, boxers, wrestlers, whatever, who have let themselves go, but in their brain they still remember the glory days of when they could wrestle, when they could punch, when they could throw an elbow strike, all that stuff. So I think there's a maintenance that comes with unarmed skill that goes beyond what we do for maintenance with armed skills, which are less physically dependent and which degrade, once they're established, will degrade in a different way and probably less dramatically over time. Once you own the physical skills of the gun, it's different from owning physical fitness. William?
I think there's a trend, especially in the coursework by Cecil Birch in his immediate action, jiu-jitsu immediate action combatives, in that it's aimed at folks who don't necessarily want to make the commitment to let's say, train jiu-jitsu on a regular basis for its own sake, but instead he's focusing on teaching folks enough to survive, like you said, that initial onslaught and avoid getting knocked out and then proceed. I think mentally the biggest problem is people simply cannot believe it's happening. When you interview victims after the fact, it says if they're speaking from a script. I couldn't believe it was happening. It was like it was happening to someone else. It was almost like watching a movie. Well, it is happening. And that's the preparation we have to do now. We have to get our minds around the notion now that it is not only possible, but certainly likely that at some point during our lifespan we're going to be physically attacked. That there's going to be physical victimization at some point, and that's a likelihood. The notion of condition yellow, as in Cooper's old color code of awareness. Condition yellow, in my mind, is that relaxed awareness, but most importantly, conscious recognition that the world is not as it ought to be. The world can be a dangerous place, and we have to get our minds around that on a daily basis so that we're not shocked into submission, and shocked into passivity, and shocked into non-response when it actually does happen.
So,
Now, with physical violence, too, interpersonal violence, I see a lot of people in classes, in our extreme close quarters tactics class and many of the unarmed women's assault prevention classes that we do, I see a lot of people who are very hesitant to get physically engaged, and that's a huge hurdle to overcome, and that comes from doing these grappling classes, wrestling classes, jiu-jitsu classes, or any of the within two arms reach classes like Craig's or mine or a couple of the other guys in the industry who do them, is understanding what it feels like to be pressed up against another human being, what it feels like to fight when your head's pushed away, what it feels like, think about what it feels like to take you could talk about putting a thumb through an eye all day long, but the college-age girl who's taking the women's assault prevention class, when I say put a thumb into the eye and kind of grab the skull and shake, there's a ooh, that's repulsive. Well, the things that happen to you if you don't defend yourself are pretty repulsive too, but there's still this difference of mindset about causing pain and violence to somebody else. Colonel Grossman's written about it on killing and things like that. Maybe, William, could you riff on that, the idea that we may have to cause this kind of violent pain?
Yeah, I frequently ask people, if you can imagine two people fighting in a parking lot, one is flat on the back, the other one is fully mounted, sort of smashing their head against the asphalt over and over again. Which are you? And people's snapshot, they don't even have to say it, I can see it on their faces, is that they're the person on the bottom. They're the person being aggressed against, they're the person losing. And that snapshot is because they don't see themselves as able to do violence, even if there was a perfectly good and legitimate reason to do it. And so getting that mental trigger in place for nice people is a lot harder than it sounds. The late trainer Paul Gomez was famous for saying, normal people don't get aggressive enough fast enough. Initiating action is very hard. Some of it is piercing that sort of veil of denial. Is this really happening? If it's really happening, is it okay to take action? Is it okay to initiate violence against someone else? And while people are trying to slog through that decision, churn through that decision, violence is being enacted against them. And if you get knocked out, your choices go to zero very, very quickly.
So what if you are the one who becomes unstable, whether in a confrontation with another person or with authorities? What should you do?
Physically unstable?
Physically, mentally?
Like losing your temper kind of thing?
I don't know. It was a question that we had someone write in on, and it says, if you are the one who's become unstable and are confronted by authorities, what should you do?
Okay, I think between the two, I think I get it now. It's not a matter of becoming unstable. The notion that when someone is let's say in kind of a righteous and indignant fury, I mean, if someone attacks you unlawfully, the response, the appropriate response is anger, is fury, is rage. The notion that that's somehow unbalanced, I think, is part of the problem. It's posing to people that the only people who ever feel strong emotions towards self-preservation are the bad guys. The only people entitled to use violence guys. That attitude itself, I would say, is part of the problem. When someone is defending themselves vigorously and aggressively and injuring their attacker, they haven't lost their temper. They've responded appropriately, as far as I'm concerned.
So
yeah, I think just like you prepare yourself to flip that switch on, you need to know now, and this is where like Masad Ayub's 20-hour class, Mag 20, and the lectures of kind of the aftermath of force and some of the stuff that we've done with Personal Defense Network, and what do you do in the immediate aftermath? What do you do in the legal aftermath? Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network is a source for information in this area. I think that just like you have to be able to turn that switch on and use violence, you also have to remind yourself that when you look over to the right and there's a police officer there telling you to do something, that you need to be obeying his commands, that you need to, when you have to shoot somebody who's been violently aggressing you in a lethal way that justifies that use of force, but then maybe their wife or their child, a teenager or whatever in the parking lot that witnessed all this now comes charging at you because they're mad because you shot their friend, the person they care about, we need to be able to flip that switch and say, well, this person's coming at me, but do I need to shoot them? I have a gun in my hand. How do I handle this? The police officer is pointing a gun at me, and I don't want to let go of my gun, but that's what I need to do because he's now in charge. He's there. Being able to turn that off and setting the switch. When do you turn that off? What happens? What are the pre-contact cues to end violence, if you will? When the good guys show up, when the medical technician is there to help you, when the police officers are telling you to stop, when it's a non-lethal threat, somebody who's angry with you, that you're angry, your temper's up there, you rightfully used force. Now this other person who's rightfully mad because their friend or whoever took an inappropriate action that you had to respond to defend yourself from, how does this keep building and building and building and building? At some point, somebody's got to be able to be prepared to turn that back down. And just as much as you have a responsibility to yourself and the people you care about to turn that switch on, I think you have a responsibility to yourself and the rest of society to be able to flip that switch back down.
Sure. I think that the average person is not familiar with ever having been in a kind of a fury, in a state of rage. And so I think that one of the cliches would be that they sort of turn into a tornado and go off through the countryside, laying waste to everything they encounter. Well, that's just not going to happen by and large. The average nice person, it takes quite a bit to get them to take aggressive action, and the off switch is ingrained. I mean, that's the morality and ethics of the good guy, is that the off switch is more readily employed. So I think folks may have a fear that they're going to lose their temper and go off, somehow become out of control. But I think that's more of a fear than a likelihood.
So last question of this live session. DJ writes, I would like to hear William's analysis of the outbreak of war on police in Baltimore, St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, and every other city in the U.S.
Well, at least it's a small question. We can get it taken care of right away tonight. I mean, there are libraries full of dissertations full of opinions about this sort of problem. But the simple fact is the relationship between citizens in those cities and the police in those cities is increasingly contentious. I mean, so much of the contact is negative in and of itself. And this is opinion only, and people can surely disagree. But I think the emphasis on police work is dominated by force protection, where the most important thing is police moving through neighborhoods and responding to events rather than engaging with people that that actually inhabit those neighborhoods. I think that's had a real negative influence. The only time you see a police officer is when there's been a negative event and he's responding to it. That makes the relationship right off the bat very, very skewed. They're not people. They're just these drones in blue who show up. And they're not seen as good guys. They're not seen as doing anything positive in the community. And that's an incredibly mistaken view and a limited view, but it's one that's enforced by a long-standing series of patterns on both sides.
Well, thank you. And thank you, William, for joining us tonight on our PDN live session dealing with violent behavior. William, do you have any last thoughts or where people can find you? Well,
on the wall of the post office is always a good bet, under Most Wanted. Yeah. I'm just grateful to have been here. It's nice to have access to some of Rob's millions and millions and millions of followers. But as much as I tease them, they tend to be a rather switched-on bunch with a good level of interest in important issues, and I think the questions really showed that tonight.
And Rob, where can we keep track of you between now and the next PDN Live session? And what is going on?
All the social media, of course, PD Network at Instagram. We put out a lot of information, personaldefensenetwork.com. We're constantly putting information out. William, for those of you who don't know, did do a DVD with us. So we have William as a Personal Defense Network contributor. He's done one of our DVDs, which, William, I don't know if you have a website yet set up to actually let people purchase them from you?
Not yet, not yet.
So if you don't run into William on a street corner somewhere selling them out of the back of his vehicle, in a maybe Walmart parking lot, you can buy them at icestore.us. For those of you who are subscribed to Personal Defense Network DVDs and you're getting them sent to your home, eventually Williams is one of the 80 or so that we've produced over the last decade, and we're really proud to have him. William, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Anybody who's interested in joining any of the PDN training tour classes 2015, personaldefensenetwork.com, follow the training tab to see the calendar. And, of course, social media, the IC Training Discussion Group, Personal Defense Network, has Facebook's presence also, so you can ask us any follow-up questions there right here in the YouTube window. I know I'm going to be able to keep an eye on that for the next hour or two. And, William, I think you're going to be able to answer some of those questions and comments as well.
Absolutely.
Great.
Awesome, guys. And just a reminder, if you like what you are hearing and seeing, please sign up for the Personal Defense Network newsletter for free. Check out the link below. And also, if you have any topics or guests that you'd like to see on PDN Live, send us an email, social@personaldefensenetwork.com. Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it. And everyone, hang out if you have any questions, and these two will stick around for a little bit.
Thank you.